Hello everyone, I am Libin Francis, Assistant Professor with Department of History. Today I would be dealing with the next topic in the modern Indian history, that is the expansion of British in India, along with the story of the conflicts between various European powers in India and how did Britain managed to become the most superior, most powerful European entity in India. We have seen that there were around 6 European powers who came to India with an ambition of establishing a developed trade with Asia, particularly with India and China. Most of the countries had a colonial ambition as well, but it was the British East India Company who was successful in establishing the colony in India. In this class, I would be dealing with the tactics Britain used in establishing the power in India and how did it manage to eliminate the other European powers, especially the French East India Company, who was the main opponent or the international rival for Britain in India. So the conflict between the British East India Company and the French East India Company was not Indian in origin, but it is a spillover from the European power politics which was engaged by the two powers in the Europe, Africa as well as in Americas, and also spread to the Asia as well. Before the story of how the British could manage the French East India Company, we have to see that how did Portugal was eliminated by the British. It was actually by the Battle of Swally in 1612 that British East India Company defeated the Portuguese naval power in a place named Swally, and the defeat of the Portuguese in India had ignited the fortunes of British East India Company in India. Later they made an agreement with Dutch East India Company for both the powers had decided to focus on different region, Dutch on the East Indies and the British on the South Asian region, that is the Indian subcontinent. So the first two powers before Britain, the Portuguese and the Dutch, were sidelined by the British East India Company, and the next powerful power the Britain had to deal with was the French East India Company. The French East India Company, which was a powerful entity as well, but had some structural problems, that the French East India Company was actually owned and directed by the French government itself. Due to the nature of the French East India Company, the power of the monarch in France would be directly reflected in the power of the French East India Company as well. So when Louis XIV was ruling in France, the French East India Company was successful in establishing the base in South Indian region as well as in the Bengal region, whereas the Louis XV who came to power by 1715, the fortunes or the graph of the company also went down because he was inefficient and corrupt. We have to see that the conflict between the British East India Company and French East India Company is termed as the Carnatic Wars, because they fought each other in the region of Carnatic, which presently constitute the Tamil Nadu region, the southern parts of Karnataka and Andhra region, and the states like Hyderabad is situated to the north of the Carnatic, Mysore to the west of the Carnatic, Kochi and Thiruvidampur to the southwest of the Carnatic. So this is the picture of the Carnatic region where the conflict between Britain and France went on. There were around 3 Carnatic wars in the series, and the first Carnatic war between the period of 1746 and 48 was actually a spillover of the events from the Europe. The Austrian War of Succession, which was an internal problem in Austria, was backed by the British in one side and the France in other, and that conflict in the Austrian region had directly carried over to India as well. So they engaged in a conflict, in a naval conflict between each other, and the region was the Madras. French East India Company under the able Governor General Dupleix had managed to capture Madras from the British East India Company and proved successful. French East India Company proved successful in the first Carnatic War in India, but in a larger context, it was the British who won in Europe. Consequently, there was a treaty by 1748 named Aix-la-Chapelle Treaty, signed in Europe, that the conflict, the Anglo-French conflict was ended, and consequently the first Carnatic War in India was also concluded with the treaty, and the provisions which the Britain captured in Europe from France was given back to France, and the places which French captured from Britain also given back. So the first Carnatic War was a neutral war. In the second Carnatic War, both the companies, both the British and French East India companies, used the policy of divide and rule, in which both the companies had sided with one or the other factions in the power struggle existed in the Carnatic as well as in the Hyderabad region. For instance, in the Carnatic region, the Nawab was Anwaruddin, but there was another person named Chanda Sahib who raised a counter claim for the throne. And in the Hyderabad region as well, there existed a power struggle between two Nizams named Nazir Jung on one side and Muzaffar Jung on the other side. French East India Company under the Governor General Dupleix had engaged into an agreement with Muzaffar Jung and Chanda Sahib and formed an alliance. And the opposite alliance was formed by the British East India Company, who had supported Anwaruddin as well as Nazir Jung in the Hyderabad region, and both the sides engaged into conflict backed by the European powers, and the European weapons were used in large number. And even though the initial victory of the Second Carnatic War was in favor of the France, who was able to capture the Madras region, but later the Robert Clive, the able commander of British East India Company, who had arrived in Madras and turned the events on the side of British. So it was the presence of Robert Clive who reverted the fortunes of French East India Company in India and captured back the Madras as well as the Pondicherry region from France. So the agreement reached after the Second Carnatic War, which was in the period between 1748 and 53, was that the French governor Dupleix had to return back to France from India. So the Second Carnatic War was ended by the time of 1753, and the war was clearly in favor of British East India Company. So the Third Carnatic War was between 1756 and 63, was also essentially a part of the European conflict existed between Britain and France in international scenario, and the war was called in the international platform as 7 Years' War between 1756 and 63, and Britain and France also engaged in a conflict in India as well. The war was clearly fought with the superior power, proved the superior power of British East India Company and the British nation in general against the France and the French East India Company. So the fortunes of the French East India Company in India as well as in Americas were all captured by the British, and French position in India was totally in threat. So what happened after the Third Carnatic War was the Treaty of Paris in 1763, in which the French possessions in India were handed over to Britain, except a small region of Pondicherry and Mahi, which were under the control of France. All the other regions were handed over to British East India Company in India. So we have to find out the significances of the Carnatic Wars in India, because they were not confined to a particular southern region, but the implications of the war had a far-reaching consequences across all parts of the nation, because there were some lessons which Britain inherited from the Carnatic Wars, which they used further to make the situations in their favor. So the first significance was that Britain proved that it was the sole superior European power in India, and no other European power were in a position to challenge the superiority of British East India Company. And they had used several policies, they had used several tactics to eliminate the other foreign powers, and they established a monopoly in trade as well as in the political situations in India. Another lesson which was learned by the British was that the superiority of the European arms and ammunition in India, because it was evident from the Battle of Saint-Thome between the Nawab Anwaruddin and the French East India Company. The Battle of Saint-Thome was the first incident of the success of a European power in India, that was the French East India Company. So Britain also realized the advantage, which essentially helped them in their expansion in the further regions. Another lesson, the fourth lesson, which Britain used later, was the realization that the absence of nationalism in Indians could be utilized in their favor in a way that Indians could be easily recruited to the British army and they would be used it against the Indian rulers as well. So this realization also helped the British to form regiments including the Indians and to fight against the Indian rulers as well. So these were all the realizations which helped the British East India Company to spread their bases across several parts of the country. Another thing we have to look into is that the reasons for the failure of the French East India Company in front of the British. The first reason was the nature of the British East India Company and the French East India Company, the difference between their nature, because the French East India Company was essentially a government owned company and all the instructions were to be directed from the government. The decision for a war, decision for a treaty would all be guided by the monarch. So the power of the monarch or the ability of the monarch in France would be directly reflected in the success or the failure of the East India Company as well. Second important thing was the nature of the trade basket of both the countries. Britain had a wide variety of trade basket and had a value of around 4 times that of the French East India Company, which made the fortunes, which made the financial or the market superiority of the British East India Company far ahead of the French East India Company. The third reason for the failure of the French was the lack of the realization of the geographical situation or the geographical contour of our country. Britain had balanced the basis of the East India Company by establishing or concentrating 3 points of the region of the country at one time, that is on the Bombay, Madras as well as in the Calcutta region, whereas the France had only had focused on the Pondicherry region, South Indian region, even though they had a base in the Chandernagar in Calcutta, but not developed as like Calcutta. So these were all the situations, and the Battle of Plassey, which had happened along with the time of the Third Carnatic War, had also turned in favor of British East India Company, and they could use the resources from the expansion of Bengal in the Third Carnatic War as well, and they could earn further victory over French East India Company by the Third Carnatic War. So this is all about the Carnatic Wars in India, and this short session of 10 minutes would be like a revision or like a summary of Carnatic Wars in India or the Anglo-French rivalry in India. Thank you very much.